What's happening, HC Nation? This is Zach Edwards with another episode of the Adventure Box podcast. This is where we talk about everything history. And you know what? Your parents might want to teach you history. Maybe you're okay with that. That's fine. Perfectly fine. Now, if they don't, or maybe they don't know much about history, or they just have no time to do it, and you just want to learn a little bit more, that's why you come here. We love to share with you and your parents and your teachers, everyone, about history. So we go over certain topics in chronological order. On Mondays and Wednesdays, we go over the early American history. And then Tuesdays through Thursdays, we go over ancient civilizations. And so that's why we actually break it down so you can actually have two units from every chapter of the book and portion of the wars. So like the first, go over it really fast, the first section of the book was the introduction on what the war was before the war started, why it started, who were the war hawks, what were the war hawks. Then we went into attacking Canada. That's right, the United States attacked Canada during the War of 1812. Then the British, after the Napoleonic War was done, after they had won, then they could turn their sights on the United States and attack us. And so they came over and attacked Washington, D.C., burned it to the ground. Most people know about that part. They also know about the Battle of McHenry, which was a fortress right outside of Baltimore. And they attacked all night long, and they could not they could not threaten the fort enough or destroy it enough to take it down. So as they were running out of cannonballs and supplies, they said, we're done. Let's go. We're done. And they left. And this is also the place where the Star-Spangled Banner, as a poem, that's how it started, as a poem was written. So we talked about that the last 3 weeks. This is the last week that we're going to be talking about the War of 1812. This week we're going to be talking about what? The battle that happened after the war was finalized. It was done, a treaty was signed, and then the British attacked the United States. You're like, wait a second, they attacked us right after we had signed the treaty? I was like, yeah, they did. But it's not exactly their fault. If I said it was their fault, that's not the full story. Okay, so let's go into it. Let's talk about it. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, first off, so today we're going to be talking about two things. We're going to be talking about the Battle of New Orleans. It's one of the most famous victories in American history, which ironically took place after the war. That's what I was talking about. The second part is the long-term impact of the war. So why was it such a big impact of, well, I should say for the battle and also the war? What was the war actually about? And I'm going to tell you this. On Wednesday, we're going to be talking more about the era of good feeling, the Barbary pirates, and basically the aftermath of what happened after the war. But just today, we're going to be focusing on the Battle of New Orleans and, let's just say it, American nationalism, and the decline of the Native American power as well, their power east of the Mississippi. So, first off, Battle of New Orleans. Okay, have any of you guys actually seen New Orleans? It's a little bit different than what you would expect. So, let's say let's see. Well, it's pretty far out. Okay, let's go a little further out. Okay, so the Battle of the Treaty of Ghent was being signed. Actually, the Treaty of Ghent was being signed, and during that treaty being signed, there was a group of ships out in the Atlantic floating away from England. Now, they were actually in the Caribbean. They weren't actually floating in the Atlantic. During this time, they were in the Caribbean, planning and plotting to attack New Orleans. They knew New Orleans was an amazing port to have control over because this is the Mississippi. If you can control the Mississippi, you control basically all trade and harbor and supplies that come through, everything that goes up the Mississippi, if you can control New Orleans. This is the same way, if you remember going back when we had the French who owned and ran the New Orleans. What did they do? They had New Orleans. They thought it was great. They did a lot of fur trading from up above, and they floated them down the Mississippi River. And then all of a sudden, they get in the French and Indian War. The British, they don't like the French. They're fighting, of course. And so the British win the French and Indian War. France, underhandedly, actually shifts it to Spain. Says here, you take this because we don't want to give the British anything else. And the Spain says, we are very powerful. We will take this. And so they take New Orleans. And then there became a struggle because there were a lot of French traders up in the Mississippi River, and they're capturing and killing all these animals, taking their furs, floating them down the river. Well, what happens if all of a sudden if Spain owns New Orleans? Now they have full control over what comes in and out of the Mississippi. So the French are getting very frustrated with them. And long story short, the United States actually buys New Orleans and the Louisiana Purchase, which we'll talk about next week, actually. Start talking about the trails westward. And during this time, we actually have the United States starting to take over New Orleans in that area. Now, the British, they've always liked New Orleans. They've always liked what it was. So you have this group of ships over here, and they are starting to come up towards New Orleans. Well, I should say down here in the Caribbean and coming up into the United States. And they're being fought off by people like Andrew Jackson. So, let's talk about the Treaty of Ghent. What was it? It officially ended the War of 1812 on December 24th, that's right, Christmas Eve of 1814. You're never going to forget that again. The Treaty of Ghent that was signed for the War of 1812 was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, 2 years after, because 1812, the War of 1812, 1814, December 24th, 1814, in Belgium. That's what it was. Yeah, it was in Belgium. Okay, the treaty declared basically a status quo. No land would change hands. Both sides would return to the way they were before the war. No lands would change. And the original causes of the war being, remember, the British, I was going to say imprisonment, but impressment is what they call it, of sailors. This is when they basically took the sailors and said, you're connected to becoming that you were a British citizen, so we're taking you as our own to be a sailor, and you have no say in it. That's basically what impressment was. That was not resolved. It was not part of the treaty at all. For some reason, and I have actually not seen a good reason for it. I've seen plenty of rationalizations of why they think it was not part of there, including the fact of the Napoleonic War was done, and they didn't want to tick off the British. So here's a twist in the news, is basically at that point, there were no telegraph lines. There were no phone calls. No one on the boats had cell phones. There was no way to contact these ships. And they were moving into position to take New Orleans at this same time. So around December 24th, 1814. And before that, actually, they were on their way. The British saw New Orleans as the strategic target, and they knew they wanted it. So if they could seize the city, it would take control of the Mississippi, which would have spun the war. But the problem was, and this is what the sailors were thinking, that would be a great thing, the war was already done, and nothing was supposed to change hands. So even if they had won, they probably would have had to get it back. So they had sent earlier 8,000 seasoned troops under Edward Pakenham. I think Pakenham. He was a veteran of the Napoleonic War. And of course, these ships came over from the Napoleonic War, came into the United States for the War of 1812. which was actually over at the time. But waiting for them was Major General Andrew Jackson. Now remember, Andrew Jackson was a militia. He was not accepted into the army until he actually worked with the army and basically pushed himself up to a higher rank. Not pushed as in he forced himself in there, but he showed them his value and kept climbing. So Jackson had literally brought together a very diverse force of U.S. regulars, state militia, free African American volunteers. Remember, this is before the Civil War, but free American volunteers he brought together, and also Native American allies. There's actually, this is the fun thing, even a band of pirates by their captain was Jean Lafayette. So Lafayette was a notorious pirate taking advantage of, because he was actually friends with British, taking over different countries' goods from the Caribbean and taking them for himself. Because he was not a privateer, there was no war where he could actually privateer. Now, he might have actually been a privateer because of the War of 1812. You know, we talked about this. A lot of the merchants became privateers, but I'm not actually sure if he was actually part of the War of 1812 privateering of merchant ships. I think he was actually a pirate for some time before. Look it up. That's actually really interesting. I'd really like to know that. I'll have to look it up myself too. So Jackson's plan was to dig in and force the British to attack his fortified position just outside the city. Now, let me show you again. United States, Great Britain. They sailed a great deal of distance, coming around Florida through the Caribbean and up towards New Orleans. When they get to New Orleans, it's like, oh, wait a second. New Orleans is basically landlocked. It's got this great outcroppment of land right here. It has the Mississippi River coming up, but it has a little bit of land right in front of it. So the British thought, well, we'll just march our men in there. 8,000 men into New Orleans. On January 8th, 1815, the British launched this assault, this full-scale assault. They docked their boats coming from their ship, took boats out to the land, and got onto the land. They marched across open sugarcane fields, towards Jackson's entrenchment, which is right about here, this area. Here's the thing. The Americans were ready. Behind the line of earthwork and artillery, Jackson's men opened fire. Now, this is interesting because this wasn't the only part. Like, a lot of people like to talk about this, but there's something that's really big that not as many people talk about. So right in front, so you have an encroachment of land. You've got all the people on the American side behind that embankment of land. You have all the British coming up. Now, this land is like all swamp, or at least it was all swampland. So they used trench work to drain irrigation, to drain the fields. And so by doing that, they had this huge trench right in front of where the encroachment was. Actually, it's a little bit out from that distance. So the British marched in and they tried to get to the Americans, who were firing from the earth embankment. So this big old pile of dirt in front of them, they're very safe behind. So all the British bullets were either going over their head, maybe occasionally taking out an American, but most of the time going into the earthwork, because they were trying to get low enough to hit someone that's laying down on the earthwork, shooting right over the earthwork. In just over 30 minutes, the battlefield was littered with British dead. Just thousands of them. And it literally mean thousands of them. Now, they weren't all dead, but there was 2,000 casualties. General Pakenham was also killed. 2 other senior officers were mortally wounded. And in total, that's what I was saying, they lost 2,000 of their men. You know how much the Americans lost? 70. 70 compared to 2,000. This is why when people march, like the old school armies, they used to march towards you. You knew that your whole front line was going to be dead by the time you got to the shooters. How did they even think that was an okay thing? You know, it's funny. You almost think, well, why didn't they just do like the geese, where they do the V and come in so that the first person always gets shot, maybe the second row and the third row and the fourth row, but everyone in between, completely safe. And the first person takes like 100 bullets because they're all shooting towards the closest person. I would say, I feel really sorry for that person right in front. And if he survives, he'll be full of bullet holes. So, marching in straight lines, marching in a V didn't really matter because everyone was shooting each other. The fact that they were marching towards them and then all of a sudden came to this trench that they could not get over because it had tall walls and was full of water. So they literally had to swim it in order to get on the other side of the land and keep marching. Again, and keep marching. And where's all their gunpowder going to be? It's going to be on their pocket. It's going to be completely soaked. Bad idea from the very beginning. If anything, forget Jackson right here. What would happen if you parked up here and started marching in? Now, it would be hard to get to New Orleans. As you can see, there's little encroachments, and this is actually probably a little bit man-made as well. So it might be a little bit harder. But you gave him the upper hand. What were you thinking? So here's the aftermath and a little bit of mythology that's part of it. So the irony is the battle had no impact on the treaty whatsoever. Peace had already been agreed upon. Land would have been given back to the Americans if the British had won. That's really sad. News of the victory, though, reached Washington before word of the treaty. Wait a second, what? Yeah, that's right. The treaty was being signed in Belgium, in Europe. Washington's waiting for that treaty. They don't even really know 100% that the British were coming around to attack New Orleans. Now, they did actually have some word of it, but I guess they would have hoped that it wouldn't have happened because the war had already been finished. So they're waiting for this treaty, and the British are coming around and attack New Orleans. And then from the victory to Washington, D.C. was closer than ships coming from Europe to D.C. Pretty interesting, huh? Another thing that's really interesting, again, another thing that not many people talk about, and you'd only hear it if you actually went down to New Orleans, which I did for a fact-finding mission. We actually, well, okay, my wife and I traveled down there, but we were able to get a lot of information. We went to a ton of museums to try to get as much information as possible when actually reviewing this curriculum, so we can actually send it out with all that information in it. Okay, so this is very interesting. Right before the battle, you actually had a lot of the high muckety mucks. So there was a huge festival going on, a celebration inside New Orleans. And all of a sudden you have all these American officers and American soldiers all entrenched in this area. And then you have the British who landed and came in. Here's the funny thing. When all of a sudden they got word, literally, they heard that the British were coming onto land, the party was interrupted. Yet it kept going afterwards. So they are basically celebrating while the British are marching towards their city. It's just like mind-blowing how they could actually do that. Okay, now from this, Andrew Jackson became a national hero. This would later make him become president because of what he did. He was called the Savior of New Orleans. And his reputation for the battle basically catapulted him, but it took him just about 15 years before he could actually become president. We'll talk more about that in the next month. Actually, so we're in May now, but after this week, so next week and following. So more importantly, though, the victory gave America a reason to celebrate. Like I said, they were already celebrating the day before. After the battle, I'm betting they went right back to the celebration. So it was celebration, it was national pride, it was nationalism. So a new sense of unity and pride that came between them, or that developed with all those people. So before the War of 1812, the United States basically were fragile. They were deeply divided. You had the Federalists in the New England area that were openly opposing war. You had many Americans who saw themselves more like Virginians or the New Yorkers or the Carolinians than they saw themselves as Americans. And the country was still young, so they hadn't really ever been in a war. But after the war, everything changed. They now were one country. They had shared experiences. They had survived basically the second war with Britain, meaning the first one was the American Revolution. And now they had a cry of, don't give up the ship, which was, remember, in the Great Lakes, you had the captain jumped up when his ship was completely dismantled and they only had a few ships. He jumped onto a rowboat, rowed over to another battleship, commanded it. He took his flag that said, don't give up the ship. And he took up that ship, which is very funny because someone gave up the first ship, but he took over the next one in order to win the battles in the Great Lakes. And then there was the emotional pull of a poem, I can't remember the name of the poem, which would become the Star-Spangled Banner, increasing the national pride. What does this do? And we're going to talk about this more on Wednesday, but the era of good feeling, this post-war surge in unity, basically led to the historic era of good feelings, which we will again go over afterwards. But it lasted from 1812 until 1820. Political parties temporarily calmed their feuds. What? Yeah, the era of good feeling was where peace had basically come to the land, to some extent. Political parties went calm, a focus on internal improvement, economic development, and also westward expansion. Manifest destiny, which we will go over next month, because we're going to be talking about the movement, the westward expansion. That's what it's called. Another one, the American leaders began to speak more confidently on the world stage. People saw that the United States could take on Britain a second time and win. So they had a lot more strength when talking to people in Africa, people in India, people in Asia, even people in Europe. So the war, though inconclusive, like no one really changed anything, it didn't change at all, had convinced Americans that the Republic could defend itself. And it was growing stronger and surviving the world's, basically a world of empires. So, here we go. The last one. The last one we're going to be talking about, well, okay, I guess there's two, but we'll put them together. Native Americans and the British abandonment. If you remember, at the beginning of the 1812, the War of 1812, so just before it started, we had the British who were basically providing Native Americans with guns, supplies, everything they need to take on the Americans. So they were basically helping the, I shouldn't say enemy, but some of the Native Americans had become enemies of the United States. Some of them were allies. So in the North, let's talk about this. Well, actually, yeah, we already talked about the Native American cultures and everything, so I'm not going to go into that today. What I will go into is talking about the wars. So if you remember, in the North, around the Great Lakes, was Tecumseh and his confederacy, bringing together all these different Native American tribes as a rallying cry against the encroaching United States. But after his death during the Battle of Thames, that was about, I think, 1813, the alliances basically collapsed. The whole confederacy went away. Now, in the South, what had happened? Well, you had Andrew Jackson down there. He had a brutal victory at the Battle of Shoehorn Bend. Sorry. So I didn't sound right when I was saying it. Horseshoe Bend. And that was in 1814. So basically near the same time. And this destroyed what was called the Red Stick Creek resistance. The Red Sticks were a group of Native Americans. This also basically forced the Creek Nation to cede over 23 million acres of land, and later would push the Cherokee out as well. Even though the Cherokee actually helped Andrew Jackson in this fight, there were some that did not. Now, that's a completely different story, and that wouldn't actually happen, the Trail of Tears, for over 15 years. It was 15 years later that would happen. But at least at this point, the era of good feeling, even the allied Native Americans could feel a time of peace, hoping that they were done. We're going to be talking about this more next week when we start talking about the westward expansion. The last thing, and this is the last thing before we go to sum up everything, is the result was a sharp decline in Native resistance. This actually led to what? More movement westward. With the British, with their support and their backing and their weapons and everything gone, the major confederacies of Native American groups were shattered. It was gone. So the American settlers poured into the west. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. And in the south you had Alabama, Mississippi. So coming up to New Orleans, yes, you have, a little further, Mississippi, Alabama. They weren't really, American settlers weren't in these areas as much. Tennessee they were. They came into Tennessee, and they came up to the northern parts of this, but they literally took over all this land, which was actually owned by the Creek Nation. And so, yeah, they just continued to move west. Now, at the same time, this is a lot of information that comes home to me, because I'm actually over here in Kansas City, but let's see, the roads came further west from St. Louis into a place called, it wasn't Kansas City, it was Independence. And from Independence, most of the trails westward would break off of that area. Whether you're going to Oregon Trail, whether you're going over the Sierra Nevadas, whether you're going down to the south, they all started in Independence, which is also really cool. So this would basically lead up to the Indian Removal Act, but that not until 1813, and also the Trail of Tears. So you have the War of 1812, the final Battle of New Orleans happening in 1815. 15 years later, the Indian Removal Act. And we'll actually go into the politics and everything about it and why that came up. So, in conclusion, let's go over a little bit what we talked about. The War of 1812. It may have ended in a diplomatic draw. Again, they didn't change hands. Nothing had really happened, except a lot of people dead. But it felt like a turning point for the United States. That's right. It was something that was new and brought pride for those in the United States. So that was a big, big thing. Now, the second thing is the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the peace treaty was already signed. And that became a symbol of defiance and triumph. How about a wave of national pride that basically we took on the British. Every single turn we ended up winning. At the same time, we didn't actually win. We lost Washington, D.C. We didn't win Fort McHenry. We just stood up against them. And New Orleans, we actually won. So, all these things said, national pride increased dramatically. Unity. People weren't just New Yorkers or Carolinians or any other isms. They were Americans. Then the last thing is the Native American nations. They basically moved west. A lot of them moved west, or they consolidated in their lands. It was a dramatic shift for Native Americans. And it was, in many ways, a war of contradictions. One that left behind victories and violence, unity and injustice. Yeah, a lot of things. But here's the question. Here's the question for you. This is your action question of the day. What do you think was the true legacy of the War of 1812? Is it the stories of maybe resistance? Maybe missed opportunities? What could we have done if we hadn't gone to war with them? Or put the embargoes on? Would we be going the same direction? Would we not be seen by the rest of the world as a superpower? Not a superpower, not even an empire, but a nation that actually could stand up against the empires. So that's my question. What do you think was the true legacy of the War of 1812? Why is it so important for us to know? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave in the comments below. Send me an email. I appreciate it. We will talk to you later. Take care, everyone. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.